Okay, good morning everyone. Let's get started. Thanks very much for joining us. Bright and breezy on one of the second to the last day of the conference. What we're discussing this morning is really one of the key issues at the heart of the work that the Centre for Social Justice does. Addiction is one of our what we describe as our pathways to poverty. These are the factors in some of the most deprived communities in the UK that hold back families, hold back communities, hold back individuals' lives. Problems like worklessness, family breakdown, serious personal debt, educational failure, and addiction. And addiction is often swept aside by people who aren't in the know as a minority issue. Yet this is, as most of you will know, terribly unfair. When we live in a country where 1 in 16 children grows up with a parent who is dependent on alcohol, 1 in 16, in some places that's 2 in every class. When we find ourselves in a country with 300,000 people addicted to heroin, and some parts of the country having particularly acute problems. When we did our report recently on addiction, we found that 1 in 40 people in Middlesbrough is using crack cocaine now. These are not minority issues anymore. These are issues that strike at a very major part of our country, that hold a very major part of our country back. And one group who is particularly prone and vulnerable to these problems are people entering and leaving the criminal justice system. We know that in half of all cases of violent crime, the offendant has been using alcohol. We know that half of all inmates say that their crime was related to their drug use. These are problems that it is within our power to fix. We have services in place which should be helping people to rebuild their lives and break out of the cycle of crime and dependency. And some of the people on our panel this morning have first-hand experience of making that work. I'm delighted to be able to introduce on my left John Glen. John is PPS to Eric Pickles, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. But he's also a former magistrate who has seen the effects of drugs on crime at first hand, and has also done one of the Centre for Social Justice's inner city challenges. And the inner city challenges where we ask members of Parliament to go and spend 3 or 4 days with one of our 350 charities, frontline poverty-fighting charities, and get them to see up close the problems they face. John was unusual in that his inner city challenge was in deepest, darkest Devon. But with Amber, who do residential rehab, which is an extremely valuable service. Residential rehab, as some of you will know, is currently suffering from terrible cuts at local government level, even though it's the most effective intervention by far. 55% of local authorities have reduced funding to residential rehab. John, we're very, very glad to have you here today. On my right is Simon Antrobus, who is the head of AdAction. Simon has many decades' experience of working in the third sector. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Just the right number of years working in the third sector. He's a particularly good friend to the CSJ, having chaired our report on gangs, Dying to Belong, which appeared a couple of years ago, a report that the government picked up on very swiftly following the riots in 2011. So we remain very grateful to him for that work. And then Professor John Podmore on my far right, or maybe I should rephrase that as well. Not on the far right,
or decades,
or on the far left if you're in the audience. Who has 25 years experience of working in Manchester Prison Service. Has governed 3 prisons: Brixton, Belmarsh, and Swaleside, and is now working very closely with Simon, looking at these issues. So, John, thanks for joining us here. John, I understand that you have to sort of leave before time, so if you don't mind, I'll ask you to speak first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I suppose often when people look at my background, I was a management consultant for 12 years. I was Deputy Director and Director of the Conservative Research Department, and I represent Salisbury in Parliament. People think, well, what does he know about these sorts of issues? And I probably don't know as much as many of you and some of the other panellists, but I would just share with you that my experience on that journey from being a researcher to an MP in Middlesbrough in 96, 97 to being a constituency MP in Salisbury from 2010, and also my experience in my own family with addiction. And I would say that the impact of addiction, be it to alcohol, be it to drugs, has a catastrophic effect in most circumstances to those families, to those individuals, and very often, in my experience, the response that various authorities and government make in their various agencies is often not sophisticated enough. It doesn't really fully grasp the time it will take to turn things around. And I've argued quite strongly with those in the party who are putting together a manifesto that we need to be more realistic, and we can quite reasonably, and obviously PPS Director Pickles will be careful what I say, there have been massive challenges in terms of funding, and I've seen cuts across local government, which has really forced local government to do things in different ways, and I would argue that in some cases that has involved a reprovisioning, a rethinking, a restructuring to better outcomes. But my experience staying at the Amber Foundation in Deepest Devon about 18 months ago, I think it was, is that actually some of the jargon around payment by results, around sort of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and turning your life around can be a little bit optimistic in the time frame. And my experience at the Amber Foundation, which I think has got 3 or 4 residential settings across the country, was to take a group of young people who were often just out of the criminal justice system and to basically give them a routine, to get them up at a certain time in the morning, to get them to do activities throughout the day, and to help them on an individual basis with the various problems that they had. It wasn't exclusively for people with addictions, but there were a large number of people there who'd experienced alcohol and drug abuse throughout their time. And what struck me was that the whole emphasis of the conversation with individuals was around how quickly, how rapidly they could set up a benefits sort of settlement for that individual and get them out of the centre into sustainable independent living. And in my conversations with those that worked there, they were quite candid with me about the actual reality of the life trajectory that some of these individuals were going to experience. And it wasn't as rosy as perhaps would be anticipated at the first time they were exited the establishment. What we really need to recognise is that, be it in Middlesbrough or be it in Salisbury, there are groups of people who feel completely disconnected from the state, from the community that they live in. And I did a 2-week placement just last week in a surgery in a community called Benton Heath in my constituency. And so many of these problems, as they came to the GP, they were complicated. There were so many comorbidities. There were so many social problems. It wasn't just about the medical problem. It was about just a poverty across many aspects of their life and their outlook. And I believe that government needs to recognise this in a holistic way. And that means, I think, investing in places like Amber, in institutional settings, to take them out of the rapid expectation of getting people on individualised benefits and a plan back to work. if somebody has not been properly educated, who's perhaps had one parent who himself or herself was intermittent in their parenting, lived in very poor housing, was exposed to alcohol abuse by a parent during their formative years, was potentially abused, got into the criminal justice system in their early or mid-teens, was institutionalised in care at 14, 15, 16, has poor social skills and life skills. I'm not sure how realistic it is to just put these people on a conventional programme of work in the belief that they will very quickly achieve a sustainable pathway to independent living. So I argue that the reality is more complicated, and yes, we can talk about payment by results, we can talk about the aspiration of the end point, but we also need to be realistic about the likely scenarios in these individuals' situations. So as a JP as well, I was a JP for 6 years in London, and I was just struck so many times by how you had the same individuals coming back into the criminal justice system. And before I became a JP, I watched the bench in Wiltshire, where I subsequently became a Member of Parliament, and I looked down the case history of one individual who had 91 convictions. And the bench was asked once again to make another decision when this individual was picked up worse for drink. The system is broken. We can't fix it by just putting people into lots of short sentences. We need to think creatively and take the short-term political hit from the Daily Mail, whoever it is, to actually get through, to actually sort some of these things out. I do believe that there's a core of people in the Conservative Party who are thinking like this, who take very seriously the work of the CSJ and the excellent reports that have been written over the last 6-7 years. As ever, the challenge is around financing it in a way that, of course, there will be some waste, there will be some failures, but we've got to think creatively, do things differently if we're going to succeed. I know too that families of those who are facing and recovering from addictions or getting to a sustainable pathway from a dark time in their life also need support, because that family structure will be instrumental in sustaining the pathway for a clean living later on. And the final thing I would say is, I don't think we need to be classifying people with addiction in one or in lower social groupings. I mean, my understanding is that addiction, particularly alcohol addiction, is growing more and more widely across our society as alcohol becomes the sort of therapy of choice for middle Britain. And we become a little bit, I mean, I've only got to go round party conference and see that. And of course there's room to enjoy alcohol on occasion, but it masks so many things. I'm more interested in getting to the root causes, and I think that as a society we need to be realistic and honest about the solutions that we offer, and not just be glib and simplistic, when actually the complicated nature of addiction and what it really takes to sustain a pathway to clean and independent living and lifestyle is complicated, perhaps more complicated than we dare.
Thanks very much. Okay. Thanks, John. I think that was a really good introduction to the subject, and it may have been a good idea for you to have advised Chris Grayling on his speech in some of this, because I think you raised some important issues that maybe haven't been recognised. I want to start just by telling you a very, very brief story. So we're here in Manchester, and Adaption runs a resettlement programme, and it's right outside Strangeways, and I met a couple of guys that have been through the service there, and what we do is, as soon as people are in
in the prison. We're working with them on their release, what they're going to do when they're released, how we're going to deal with their addiction, whether it's making sure they've got their methadone in place and they're on a recovery plan, their housing is stable, all of those things we're working on it. And I met a couple of guys who've been through the system, and in fact one of them spoke here a couple of years ago, and he said that was absolutely vital in terms of getting him back on the road to recovery. That a team of people who were connected up to him whilst he was in prison and planning and preparing with him for his release, and then working with him on his release. Now I'll tell you that story for two reasons. One, because it exemplifies the importance of recovery and resettlement plan for people in prison with addiction problems. But I also tell you because that service doesn't really exist anymore. Actually, when the commissioners recommissioned the service here in Manchester, they decided that actually they didn't want that resettlement programme, and we don't deliver it. We deliver a small family resettlement programme in Manchester now because Heineken funded some family workers, but actually the main body of that work doesn't take place anymore, and that's a real shame. And I think that's the reason why we've got to think carefully about this when we're developing it in the future. And I'll just run through, Alex did talk about some of the facts and figures, but I think they're really important. Almost 60% of adult offenders released from prison serving short-term sentences, so that's probably under 12 months, re-offend within 12 months, it's a stat we all know. 22% of prisoners surveyed by the HM Inspectorate reported having an alcohol problem. That's one I'm not sure I believe, it's a very low figure, I'm sure it's higher. 60% of those who entered with a prison with an alcohol problem felt that they would leave with an ongoing problem. And also over half of the prisoners reporting an alcohol problem said that they also had a drug problem and mental health issues and emotional issues as well. So, we've really got to think about these things if we're going to address some of these issues. And I've got some suggestions, but first let's just think about some of the challenges. I think even when we're looking at this, and we talked about Addictions Resettlement Service up here in Manchester, I would say there's a lack of specialist recovery-focused services that link up what's going on in prison with the outside. I think there's little investment in the whole issue around prisoner-family relationships and the recovery capital you've got in families, because they're either part of the problem, part of the solution, but you should be working with them. And we know that works up here in Manchester with our family resettlement service. I don't think there's enough preparation. As soon as people come into prison, we should be thinking about this. And then we've got to recognise too that a lot of the people we're working with have hugely complex needs as well. It isn't just about their addiction, although that is vital and important. So, what can we do to address some of these issues? I'll take you through some suggestions from my point of view. So I think the first one is that what we have to do is, as soon as somebody enters prison, we should be thinking about their release. So part of their sentence plan should include an assessment around what happens when this person leaves prison. So that's the starting point. I think the other thing, of course, is that, which we do with our alcohol resettlement service up here in Manchester, is you need to have a connection between what's going on outside. A lot of these prisoners will be known to drug and alcohol treatment services. It's probably not the first time they've been in prison. They may be on some kind of recovery plan, some treatment plan in the community, so we need to make sure that what's going on in the community, what they've been doing in the community, is hooked up with what's going on in prison to what goes on when they come out. And I think it has to be focused on not just about the care and maintenance of that individual's health and well-being, it has to really focus on recovery. So we're not just thinking about, okay, how can we sustain this, but how can they not cause us too much of a problem in prison, but actually generally thinking about what we do when they leave in terms of their recovery. And it can't be, essentially then it can't be term dependent. So it's not just about what's going on in prison, it's about thinking about what's going on before they came in, when they come in, and when they go out. And I think as well, because a lot of these issues are not about just their addiction, we need to think about the health and well-being side of things, about people's building people's self-esteem and well-being. We saw that yesterday at one of our fringe events where actually there's some small things you can do to help build and develop people's self-confidence and self-esteem. That goes a huge way to building their recovery capital. So, what things, I was asked to suggest one thing that we might do in terms of building a better resettlement opportunity for people coming out of prison. I'm going to be cheeky and say two. This is my want. The first one, I think, is that, you know, the government, and you mentioned this, John, the government has got to, whichever government it is, has got to really wake up to the issue of resettlement and do something about it and recognise that this is, as you say, it's not a short-term, quick-fix solution, that we've got to take our time about this. And I think we need to have a really clear resettlement strategy, a clear understanding of what that means, and put some hope and aspiration to people who find themselves continually going through the prison system. So that's number one. I think the second one is probably a bit more controversial, is that, you know, a lot of these prisoners who are on the short-term sentences going through the prison system have things that the prison system really isn't built to deal with at the moment. So addiction, mental health issues, complex needs, all of those things. So we should really be asking ourselves, should we be putting those people through the prison system? Should we not be thinking about another way of dealing with those individuals in the community, thinking about proper rehabilitation, community rehabilitation and recovery services that enable them to take that big step, the long journey to recovery, to lead independent lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much. John.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up, needless to say, on some of the prison issues. I think it's fair to say that a lot of money has been put into prisons for drug treatment, and that has increased steadily over the years. I go back to, you know, when I started 25 years ago, it wasn't really an issue, there certainly wasn't much money. Whether there's been a strategy for that, I would probably argue with. But a lot of that money has been focused on opiate treatment, less so on stimulants. But you might be surprised to learn that in terms of alcohol has been and remains the Cinderella service. I can tell you, over 25 years in prisons, I have not delivered any alcohol services. There were none to deliver. I would deliver alcohol detox, because I've worked in local prisons, and acute alcohol detox is a very important issue. If it's unassisted, the chances of you dying are severe. So I think, and one of the reasons I'm heading up the Alcohol and Crime Commission is, I'm conscious that there's not more money around. I'm not naive in that standpoint. It's a case of where we shift the resources that we got and where we prioritise resources. And you know the stats, and we're coming out with some new stats with our commission, the relationship between alcohol and crime. Obviously not at the conference, but you know, you walk around the city centres and you will see alcohol-related crime. It's a bit of a no-brainer from that point of view. So we need to be prioritising alcohol much more. The other thing about prisons is, I mean, I think there is a lot of stigmatisation of people with all sorts of addictions outside. The same happens in prisons, and there has been something called the Integrated Drug Treatment Service. You would hope that it does what it says on the tin. But I struggled, and I know prisons still struggle with integrating the alcohol treatment with stuff to do with families and to do with employment, and you know, there are people in prison on methadone, and if you're in prison on methadone, you know, there is still the belief that you're some kind of maniac who needs 4 or 5 prison officers around you whilst you take your methadone treatment. So there is still to work to do there. But I want to pick up on some of the things that Simon was saying about resettlement, because that's what we're really all about. And he's absolutely right. Resettlement should begin at sentence, when people are convicted. That should be the start point. Well, what we are in this country, we are good at locking people up. Locking people up, and I've done it for 25 years, is pretty easy. The difficult bit is getting people out. kind of statistic, we release 80,000 prisoners a year, such is the turnover. So we're letting 80,000 people out of prison back into the community, and that's the bit that we're doing badly. And we know what works. We know that if you release someone with a job and a home and a stable relationship, then the chances of them coming back are significantly reduced. Now, I've been passionate about the concept of resettlement prisons because I think Simon's right. If we lock up too many people for the wrong reasons and too long, but prisons are here. We have 84,000 people within them. And the government has come up with, it's going to establish or rename, call it what you will, a number of resettlement prisons. But I would challenge government there. What it's not doing is setting up resettlement prisons, it's renaming them. Belmarsh, one of my old gaffs, probably the most secure prison in the country. I built good chunks of it. Has 1,000 prisoners. 200 are very serious, very dangerous. The rest are no different to anyone else at Wandsworth. Can you create a resettlement culture in a place like that? I would suggest not. We're about to close North Allerton up in the northeast, which, in terms of payment by results, is kind of scratching its head because it was a successful resettlement prison, meeting all its targets, well integrated with the community. And even the community, even the local football team was saying, why are you closing it? We've got people coming and helping us, working in the community. Communities cut crime, and communities cut crime better than cops, I would suggest. And the answer for me lies in communities, and I'm delighted to be on the panel with someone from the Department for Communities and Local Government. And if I were to issue a challenge, it would be about the way in which we run some of our prisons. I mean, at the moment, and this is not for a debate here, we have public prisons and we have private prisons, and the ratios of that will change over the next few years. But what we don't have is prisons run by communities, and I think communities could run prisons. I know Policy Exchange have done some work around the role of police and crime commissioners, but at the last meeting we had, the question was asked, do people care? My evidence working in Brixton and various other places, particularly in Brixton, particularly in an inner city community, people do care. I think communities care because communities are picking up the pieces, and the more we can get communities involved, the better. So let's be brave. Let's look at another model in which we run our prisons, and particularly our resettlement prisons. Thanks.